Welcome to the Filmlings podcast.
A bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 108, Pandemic Panic.
Yes, it's a timely episode because I think almost everybody's doing something like this right now, but it's relevant. Really. And that's because we're all stuck inside of our houses at the moment, as we should
Alex,
be, which is your social responsibility.
I think all three of these movies are epidemics. Contagion might be a pandemic, but most of them are more localized.
Outbreak and flu are epidemics, which threaten to become pandemics, and that's key plot points. Contagion's definitely a pandemic. It's like all over the world. And actually, you know what, Jonathan? There are a few lines in flu which hint that it is a pandemic.
Like the fake British guy?
Yeah, there's like reports of infections in other countries. This is just the really big one in South Korea that they're dealing with. So there's hints that it could be, and they don't want it to become more than that. But all the diseases that we're going to talk about today are a little extreme, a little out there. So in case anybody is going to watch any of the movies today and is terrified by them, please don't be. Coronavirus is bad. We should all be taking this seriously, and we are. But the mortality rate for coronavirus is a fraction of a percent compared to these movies. It's about 2% for coronavirus, and I think these movies range from something 100%?
Like 100%.
Yeah, it's like 25% to like 100%, which are all like world-shattering diseases. And all of them are a little ridiculous in their own way. Everything, and the one that isn't that ridiculous is almost swings too far the other way into being a little boring. But
yeah,
we will say the
parallels are eerie at times.
Yes, yeah, no, it brings up a lot of interesting points. But I think the big thing we're going to be looking at today, which will be interesting, will be that these are all movies that are made before the modern world has really experienced a large-scale pandemic where we all have to change the way we live for a little while.
They're all conjecture.
Now we're going to look at it afterwards. And then at the very end, we're going to be talking a little bit about predictions about how this is going to change the movie industry and Hollywood itself, which, by the way, if you're wondering, is completely shut down right now. I am holding on to my job, but just barely for the time being. I'm going to stretch it out as long as I can. But there's no production going on right now. There's some interesting stuff in the works that I can't talk about, but the way that Hollywood makes and releases the content that it makes is probably going to change forever because of this. And we're going to take a look back at the most recent global pandemic, Spanish flu, which happened in 1918 in a nascent film industry. And we're going to see how that affected the nascent film industry and essentially how it helped create the mega Hollywood of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and that died in the 60s. But before we get to all of that, let's talk about the films that we're going to talk about today. What are they, Jonathan?
Yeah, so we're starting out with Outbreak from 1995, which if Netflix hasn't convinced you to watch it yet, then we probably won't either.
Everyone's wearing Outbreak. Everyone's watching Outbreak right now.
Yeah, it was directed by Wolfgang Petersen, and then we'll be following up. None of these really have awards, so we're kind of just setting them up. Following that with Contagion from 2011, which seriously everyone is watching right now because it probably is the closest depiction of our current situation. And that was from 2011, directed by Steven Soderbergh. And finally, we'll be wrapping up with Flu, or The Flu, depending on which website you're on. It's really inconsistent. From 2013, Korean film directed by Sung-Soo Kim. And it's different, but
it's a different movie.
Way.
It's much closer to Train to Busan than
even
the other
the
two
host,
movies.
I realized.
Yes, yeah, no, very, very much so. But let's start off with Outbreak from 1995 to discuss what that movie is about. Jason, take it away.
Outbreak from 1995. Colonel Sam Daniels is an expert virologist in service of the U.S. military. He and his crew investigate the spread of a new disease in Zaire, an incredibly infectious and deadly disease called Motaba. Thankfully, the disease isn't airborne, and the site seems to be contained. Back home, Sam's marriage has fallen apart. His wife has moved to LA and taken his 2 dogs with her. Meanwhile, a mysterious monkey named Betsy is set loose from a research facility and seems to be spreading a strain of Motaba around a small town in California. As Sam rushes to investigate, seemingly against the will of those in power, he soon discovers that this is an airborne version of Motaba with a 100% fatality rate. Soon the government is ready to destroy the town to prevent the devastation of the entire country. The fate of the world and Cedar Creek is on the line as Sam rushes to find the origin and cure for this doomsday virus.
All right, Jonathan, I have to start off with what I'm most impressed about when it comes to this movie, and that has to be the production design team. The production design team does like does the really heavy lifting in this movie, in my opinion. Like the sick makeup is brilliant. All of the sets are done up really, really well. Like the containment units, the hazmat suits. They have like some different hazmat suits throughout the movie. A lot of them are maybe a little over the top, a little sci-fi. I don't think any practical hazmat suit making company would ever make a diagonal zipper. But
none of them are rip-proof.
It looks cool. None of them are rip-proof for some reason. I don't understand why. And then apparently you spray it with like lemon pledge when it rips. But I think honestly that's the best part of this whole movie for me, because if you take a look at the rest of the movie, and keeping in mind that they hadn't gone through something like we're currently going through yet, it's basically kind of like a B movie. Like it's very much a disaster movie. It's pretty schlocky in a lot of parts, and goes into territory that's almost a little farcical. And like 4 or 5 months ago would have been like, oh, that's ridiculous, but it's entertaining. And now there is kind of an angle to it where it's like, oh, that's inaccurate and a little mean.
Yeah, and we know for a fact how inaccurate it is. Yeah, I feel like one of the interesting things watching this movie is you can almost tell that the studio didn't think a movie about an outbreak would sell, and so they just pumped it full of a bunch of marketable points, like the all-star cast and big action set pieces that nowadays, with our current deal of just being locked at home, people are thinking about so many story ideas about people just sitting around, and like how slow and honestly boring a pandemic is for those who aren't really affected. And then this is just like, it's so exciting. There's all like panic and riot, and which we're going to see in all of these to varying degrees. But like I'm thinking about the Hicks that try to shoot down a helicopter. Like,
yeah,
some of this stuff goes way over the top.
Yeah.
But it feels like the movie thought that without it, it wouldn't have been compelling enough.
Yeah. No, it is not going for any sort of high drama. And in fact, the most dramatic, in the traditional sense of drama, the most dramatic storyline that we get is probably in my opinion, rather uncompelling marital drama that we get mixed in here. I don't know about you, Jonathan. I have no idea why these two were together in the first place. I have no idea why they broke up. I hardly know who Sam is as a character. Like he's.
We all know what you think about the name Sam.
I have opinions, but he's either like milquetoast vanilla, like has no emotions, or he's like screaming his head off. Like those are his two settings. He's both like described as a rebel and like a control freak at the same time, and I'm like, well, this character makes no sense. And
I mean,
it's almost a shame that it's weird that I'm going to complain about this, but it's almost a shame that in the first half hour of the movie, there's so much time spent on this like needless or uncompelling marital drama. When it's like, well, people are being infected. Let's watch that. Let's watch this guy with the monkey like secretly infect the whole world on accident. Like, let's watch the interesting stuff. This stuff is not Dustin Hoffman losing his wife for being some kind of milquetoast is not interesting to me.
Yeah, and the other thing is that another kind of thread that we're going to see, except I think Contagion actually does a decent job of avoiding this, is that our main kind of like human drama thrust both coincidentally happen to be involved in some kind of health business that ends up being affected. So he's part of the military hospital medical unit, and she's part of the CDC. And so the fact that they're in a relationship and then this outbreak, and so it kind of brings them together because they have to work together. Although they didn't really have difficulty working together, I kind of almost would have expected the fact that, you know, they've been going through this divorce and all this, like having that dramatic of a relationship would interfere with the ability to cope with the outbreak and then, you know, putting more lives at jeopardy. But it was just kind of like, oh, okay, we're just working now. And we're also like semi bickering while we're working on this thing.
Yeah.
So if you're going to do that kind of thing and put these two people in these important roles that relate to your plot and also have a conflict between them, that conflict should probably affect the plot in some way, which it doesn't here.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, not to mention that her character almost makes all of her professional decisions based off of her relationship to Dustin Hoffman's character, which like if she's good enough to get to be the head of the CDC, she would not be making a decision based on the fact that her ex-husband thinks it's a problem. Like that would not be something that's happening. At a certain point in the movie, she essentially gets a call from him and he's like, hey, there is a problem. We need to jump on this. And we've, as an audience, have seen that there's a problem. And there's evidence that there's a problem. And she just kind of like waves it off. Of course, 2 scenes later, she gets smacked in the face by it. Although I still don't know if that one guy who was with her ever finishes his French fries, which disturbs me.
Yeah. Okay, so that's something we got to talk about, because we got to talk about the
French fries?
The Contagion spreading montage, which is a staple of all these movies. And so we kind of start with seeing the guy who was handling the monkey be sick, and then he starts touching stuff and coughing on people, and then we get this montage of other people not feeling good but being in public and coughing in people's faces and touching everything. We get the movie theater scene, which is kind of infamous right now. As far as
the movie theater scene is a little, like, I get why it's there. It's a little silly to me. There's a lot of people, like, so the disease they're fighting is called Motaba, and it is really strong, like unbelievably 100% strong.
100% mortality rate.
100% mortality rate, which
is insane. Actually, it's unthinkable.
I looked up. There aren't really any diseases, like any viruses that have 100% death rate. There are some with really high death rates. One of the most deadly diseases that you could, even in a lifetime, possibly remotely have a fraction of percent of a chance of catching is avian flu, which has like a 60% death rate. And we actually see that in Flu, the movie that we're going to talk about today. But the only things with 100% death rate are like a brain-eating amoeba. Like, there is no virus that
which isn't even
this.
a virus.
Yeah, this is a fictionalized virus for sure. One of the reasons that things that are this deadly don't spread that far is that they kill people so fast. And we see a lot of people essentially doing activities in this movie that if they truly were that sick, there's no way they'd be doing. The medical researcher who like is an idiot and sticks his hand in the centrifuge and gets the contaminated blood on him. And then he's like, I feel terrible. Maybe I caught a disease. And then he goes out on a date with his girlfriend to a movie theater while feeling like trash. And I'm like, you know you have a disease. You are not that big of an idiot.
Yeah, and this movie is the worst offender when it comes to this other outbreak trope, which is people knowing that they've been exposed and ignoring it and not telling anyone. People in the CDC, in the military medical department, knowing that their suit was ripped, or knowing that
the Christopher Plummer character literally gets infected. He's a doctor who
Alex won't say Kevin Spacey's name, so just translate Christopher Plummer to Kevin Spacey.
We all know what I mean. So he's a professional doctor who works in essentially the military equivalent of the CDC. He rips his suit, believes he's been affected, and then hides it. Like, it adds drama, but there's no motivation for it.
He's not even like an evil character. He's one of the good guys.
Yeah. He's not like nefarious in this movie. And that's just one of those points where you have to remember what this movie's trying to be. And it's just trying to be a B-movie entertainment film from 1995. It's not... In like a little, like a very undone genre. Like, this is not a common genre at this point in time. And it really wasn't. And it will probably be in the next 10 to 20 years.
Right.
But it really wasn't at the time.
It keeps using the action genre as a crutch when it thinks it's lacking a little bit. So then you get the set piece of the Hicks fighting the actually, basically, they just add helicopters whenever they think it's starting to lag.
That actually is like if you chart the minute mark of this movie against the number of helicopters in it, it rises exponentially.
Yeah, there's a lot of the production budget went towards helicopters.
I do not want to imagine their helicopter budget.
But it is one of those things where, like, even by the end of the movie, it's almost completely forgotten that it's about an outbreak. And that's actually an issue that I have with all three of these movies is I know that it sounds probably boring on paper, but right now, what I want to see from an outbreak movie is the recovery period. I want at least a little bit of, like, showing things starting to slowly get back to normal, as opposed to it's just like there's this one, like, really big showdown at the end, and then it's kind of over because they got the cure or whatever. Like, they just get the cure and then the movie's over, kind of a thing. Contagion, it goes a little bit different direction, but there's still no real coming down period, really. So that's just an interesting thing that I noticed in all three of these movies.
Yeah. And I think this is a little bit slipping into overall notes, but I think we both have ideas of what we really want to see out of pandemic-themed movies in the future.
Moving forward, yeah.
I think there will be action movies and disaster movies made from it, but I think that'll take a few years for people to, like, get it out of their systems. Like, once it's done, nobody's going to want to see schlocky fun about it.
Yeah, and no one wants to be the first one to do it, I feel like, also.
Yeah, no. Somebody will. Somebody will be that opportunist, but nobody wants to be the first. I think the interesting stuff will come out of the drama that we see told about the quieter stories around the pandemic, about people who are stuck in self-isolation alone, or with people who are like families that are on the verge of falling apart, and then suddenly they're stuck in isolation together.
Almost
there's
like
a million interesting personal stories you can do, because essentially the entire human race right now is undergoing, like, an extreme social experiment of, like, what if you have to be in this one place? We're so used to being on the go all the time, and being around and moving and constructing all of our social relationships around that idea that we go to work every day, that we come back, that we have this amount of time to see these people. And that has all been upended overnight. And seeing the values and the personality change and the dramatic arcs that come out of people suddenly stuck in that isolation is what I think is going to make the best movies that come out of this experience.
Yeah. And
also,
honestly,
there's going to be some killer documentaries.
Yeah, seriously. Because there's so many stories to be told on, like, several different angles. But I think that the best fictional example that I can think of that already exists that kind of does that isolation thing is 10 Cloverfield Lane, which puts it in a sci-fi context, but you could almost just take all the sci-fi elements and turn them into a pandemic, and the movie would work exactly the same. But that's a discussion for a different time.
It's still a little extreme compared to our current experience.
Yeah, but it's the way to do it in, like, make a drama that uses a drama thriller, to be fair, that uses this like containment type of a thing, because that's a lot of the tension comes from the containment in that movie. I will say, let's kind of just hit this on all the different points as far as where the disease comes from. So in this film, the disease comes from Africa, and it's carried by a monkey.
Okay, so this took me a couple watches to understand, Jonathan, what was going on here. That monkey was infected with the weaponized strain of the virus that was created in America in that testing facility where the monkey was being kept after it had come from Africa. It was infected with the standard Motaba, and then in the facility in America, it was infected with the weaponized Motaba. And it took me 2 watches to understand that was what had happened.
Okay, because I thought in the testing facility, they just had found a cure for a potential weaponized disease.
No.
They created the disease and the cure in that lab?
They created the cure to the original disease, and then they weaponized it.
Okay, yeah.
And gave it to the monkey.
And then it mutated. That's the other thing that happens in all of these movies, is there's a mutation at some point that makes the original cure ineffective.
Yes. There are new, or as the scientific term is called, novel versions of these viruses, which makes them so dangerous because we don't have a pre-prepared response for them. Yeah. But yes, the plot is really convoluted. It took me a while to understand, and then of course, I kind of get the villainous motivations for Morgan Freeman and Donald Sutherland.
The political stuff gets so convoluted. I kind of
get it, but it is a bit of an extreme response to their situation. Even like they could totally have worked with Dustin Hoffman and not revealed their involvement in creating this weaponized strain of the virus.
Yeah, and Morgan Freeman kind of has this change of heart thing, but you're still kind of confused on what he did and what he's changing his mind on. That none of it really hits home very hard.
Yeah, it does not hit home very well in terms of that plot. There's also that weird line where Morgan Freeman drops a word that bugs the living hell out of me. Yeah,
that's right. He says
he's supposed to say, I believe, "You do what I say you do." Or you do what I say to do, or you do what I tell you to do, or something like that. But instead, he says, "You say what I say do."
It just sounds so ridiculous, especially coming from Morgan Freeman, who has such a commanding presence just in general.
It's clearly a bad take, and I don't know why it was used. It still upsets me a little bit that it was used.
Yeah, but that's kind of a minor point. All right, so anything else about...
in your book, it's minor.
Yeah, that's true. I mean...
in my book, it's major.
I think at that point in the movie, I was just, not nitpicking anything because I'd kind of given up on it.
Okay, I suppose.
All right, well, let's move on to Contagion then from 2011. Jason, set that one up for us.
Contagion from 2011. A woman from Minneapolis dies of an unknown disease after a trip to Hong Kong. Many people aboard the same plane or who spent time with her in Hong Kong, including her lover and her son, soon catch the disease and die as well. Her husband, Mitch, catches and survives the disease asymptomatically. Meanwhile, Dr. Ellis Cheever of the CDC and his field agent, Dr. Aaron Mears, work overtime trying to track and contain the spread of the disease. Their colleague, Dr. Ali Hextall, decodes the mutationous origins of the disease and starts work on a cure. In Hong Kong, WHO epidemiologist Dr. Leonora Orantes scores CCTV tapes of the Minneapolis visit, trying to track the source of the infection. As many cities are infected and succumb to fatality rates as high as 20 to 30%, many turn to online conspiracy theorist and conman Alan Crumweed, who slanders the CDC and champions the use of forsythia, a homeopathic cure. Normal life goes away and society seems on the verge of collapse as the virus, fear, and false information spread in this insightful look of what the experience of a pandemic could look like.
All right, Jonathan. So when we're talking about this movie, we're going to kind of step into the world of... We are. This is true. We're kind of stepping into the world of one of the auteur directors out there who we haven't talked a lot about.
He's almost experimental a lot of times.
He is very experimental. He likes to shoot a lot of his stuff with an iPhone, which upsets me.
But he also... isn't he the one who... he like turned Raiders of the Lost Ark black and white as a composition experiment?
I don't know for sure. It sounds like something he would do. And here's the thing. He has a really good eye. He's the cinematographer. We're talking about Steven Soderbergh, by the way. I realize we haven't said his name yet.
Yeah.
He's a very good cinematographer. He directs and does the cinematography on all of his films. And the cinematography in this movie, again, as well as the set direction, the visuals as a whole are very good. There's a lot of it that kind of pushes the bounds, a lot of the flashbacks. Typically, you have a style on flashbacks in a movie. In this movie, they use like just a smearing of Vaseline over the lens for flashbacks.
Split diopter effects.
Yeah, split diopter effects. The suit that Jude Law's character wears is really unique and odd because he's a really unique and odd character.
It took me an embarrassing long amount of time to realize that was Jude Law.
Really?
Yeah, I know. I know this guy, and then I was like, "Oh, of course, Jude Law."
Was it his stupid hat?
Yeah, it was his hat, and his accent was a little different from what I'm used to.
Yeah, his hat early in the movie upset me,
and then his spaceman outfit that we'll have to talk about later.
I did love that outfit though. That was incredible. I liked that a lot. That was good. But the cinematography in this movie is great. I feel like I understand where he's going with the entire idea of the movie, like where it's supposed to move. And the idea behind it is essentially like, let's do a really realistic version of
as realistic as we can think of without having any examples to go by like we do now.
Yeah.
So I feel like this movie would be completely different if it came out next year. But for coming out, he's basically trying to anticipate exactly what is happening right now. And it's interesting to see what he gets right and wrong as he goes through it.
Yeah. The writer actually has spoken out, and he's been interviewed a lot recently. All the people who made these movies have been interviewed a lot recently, for obvious reasons. And he said he consulted a lot of disease experts and virologists on the subject before he wrote it, and it's meant to be very realistic. And in that fact, it has a toned down quality to it, where nobody's, for most of the movie, nobody's rioting in the street. Nobody is screaming or bleeding profusely. There's no monkeys until quite a way into the movie.
But there are monkeys.
It still has those absurd elements there. I keep wanting to say it knocks out all those crazy elements, but it really doesn't. It just keeps them a little toned down. But at the same time, for me, Jonathan, this movie is like so toned down that it kind of becomes boring.
Yeah,
like there isn't a lot of connected personal drama in this movie. There's a little bit, but we don't spend a lot of time on those topics. And then the investigation storylines are either take really random turns, like when I think she's either South American or French, but like
Marion Cotillard,
her character.
Okay, well, I think she was French. Just
yes, the French, the French doctor for the WHO who was working in Southeast Asia during the pandemic, trying to track down where patient 0 got the disease in the first place, which is a really interesting storyline. Like putting a mystery in there is a really interesting idea, but she just gets like kidnapped partway through her storyline,
and then gets like a
Stockholm
syndrome.
Yeah, and the next scene we see her in, she has complete Stockholm syndrome, which maybe that's genuine. I don't know. We don't get a lot of time with a lot of these characters. Yes, it is. You're 100% correct. It is interesting, but we don't get enough time with nearly any of these characters to really feel compelled by what's going on. Yeah, and I think
that was my big takeaway is I was thinking if the whole movie was Matt Damon's story, I think it would be way more interesting. Or, even just pick any one of them. Like the ensemble portion of it gives a broader picture, but it also lessens the overall impact at the same time.
Yeah. And there's some really interesting, complicated characters in here who face interesting, complicated decisions. One of my favorite story beats is actually when Lawrence Fishburne's character tells his, I think, girlfriend at the time about the pandemic before official announcements to do certain things were announced, and then it got out that he had told her ahead of time.
Yeah.
And it was a really personal decision that we understand why you would do something that based so much on your personal interest, but at the same time, it feels wrong to be doing that when you're in a position where you need to be making decisions responsibly for the most good of the most people. Which is really an interesting take. Yeah.
My favorite story beat is the bit where the CDC worker wakes up and realizes that she's infected and suddenly makes all the right decisions. She calls even the cleaning staff at the hotel that she's staying at. She calls Lawrence Fishburne. She says, and they're having this conversation. He's trying to reassure her, but she's so involved with the study of this disease that she knows that she only has a couple days left. And she knows all the symptoms. She starts, practically writing her will right there in her hotel room. It's one of those things where, especially coming off of Outbreak and seeing all the CDC people and the health workers, try to cover it up and do this weird pride thing. And then she's like, I know what I have to do. I know that I'm not going to make it. And I've got to tell everyone that I can. And she starts recording all her symptoms, all that, she just hits all the right beats, but it's so somber because it's such an emotional realization followed by a very critical and professional response. And I liked that moment a lot.
Yeah, it is. And to talk about the disease a little bit in this movie, it wasn't a guarantee that she'd die.
Yeah, that's true.
There's only a 20% death rate. But one of the things that we do see in the movie that we hear a lot about nowadays with the coronavirus is that once enough people start getting sick, the death rate has a tendency to go up because the care that is required to take some of the cases from a fatal case to a survivable case is no longer available. So they find a stadium, it becomes a mass hospital. Soon outside there's a mass grave. And she's behind that curve enough so that she is in the mass hospital. And then from that point, she's kind of doomed. Also, that kind of makes all of her efforts earlier in the movie more noble, which is just kind of goes to show that even when you're trying to portray something as realistically as possible, you are still bound to the necessities of dramatic fictional storytelling.
Mm-hmm. And to keep going about the disease itself, we have the closest to the actual origins of the disease that we're facing, which is that it came from Hong Kong, technically, and it was some kind of mix of bat and pig DNA, which we have SARS as a precedent with the bat DNA. And then our current one, if you're not aware, is a combination of bat and pangolin DNA. And so coming from this kind of shady meat dealing in China / Hong Kong, however you want to classify that. And then spreading from there just with poor hygiene, was
the
pretty
pig
interesting.
Was definitely the pig that ate the fruit that the bat dropped, which is kind of, I'm going to be honest, a bit of a letdown in terms of a reveal. It's this doesn't matter at this point.
Well, I think it was a letdown because it was the last beat of the movie.
This is true.
Yeah, it felt unsatisfactory at that point.
Yeah, and it had no impact on the resolution. The fact that it came from those animals had
doesn't matter
impact
anymore.
on how they
we already
how they
basically
solve it.
figured that out. Yeah, it doesn't matter that, it doesn't matter seeing it once we've basically figured out where it came from. But I think that the other interesting thing about it being so close to that reality of it originating in China is that I feel like nowadays, I don't know how this progression started, but there's no way that you could basically incriminate China for a world pandemic in a movie that you want to be profitable these days. Like, unless
that wouldn't
China
happen.
comes in and like creates the cure or solves it or something like that. Like the current Hollywood
by a
market
major
is
studio,
so
it wouldn't
pandery
happen.
to the current situation is so pandering towards Chinese culture and Chinese government and all that kind of stuff that you can't do this anymore. Even though it's accurate, it's so accurate.
You couldn't do a major blockbuster that way. You could do a lower level movie where you're not hoping for a release in the Chinese market, but a lot of blockbusters these days are pretty much bound to try to get one of the berths in the Chinese market. Which is a bit silly because the where the virus came from doesn't really matter to China or anyone else. Like, it shouldn't matter. It's just the virus happens. And once it happens, it's everyone's responsibility to try to do the best they can with it. But it does not matter where it comes from. It couldn't matter less. It's so... bringing politics into a situation like this is silly, but as we've seen, that is what happens. It is unavoidable. And in this movie, even, we have a crazy demagogue who is rallying people to a fake cure, which we've seen instances of in our current situation, or unproven cures.
I love Jude Law's because this is 2011. Early 2000s were like big blog era, right before YouTube and vlogging really took off.
He used the term blogosphere.
Yes, and he's so fixated on unique viewers. He says, I have 1 million unique viewers on my site every day. And he says that term like 3 times, which sounds so outdated now.
It really does.
Technically, we still use the term unique viewers, but we don't use it as like a big kind of puff word. But he was, the whole blogging thing. And then the guy, the one scientist who takes a stab at him and is like, you're not a writer. He's like, yes, I am. He's like, you're a blogger. That's not even journalism. And it was just like, okay, so we got some hot takes going on here.
Hot takes. We got your hot takes.
Take soup.
Man, that sounds familiar, Jonathan. Where'd that come
Jude
from?
Law's character was really interesting. That was an old outtake of yours, the hot take soup. I gotta find that again.
Oh gosh, that was from a while ago. Okay, so what did you think of the solution they found to the virus in this film? Because it feels a little unrealistic. I know it's based off of a real story where a guy proved that ulcers were caused by bacteria and injected himself with a cure to test it.
Oh, that's right. I was trying to remember what happened. Yeah,
but it feels pretty abrupt to me. One, because I didn't notice this person as a character until the point where she's like injecting herself, minor. And suddenly she has a dad in the hospital. I'm like, okay, that's not a bad character plot, but it would have been nice to have introduced that a while ago.
Yeah,
and maybe I missed it. But if I missed it, it's because there's so many characters that we're hopping around between that there's not enough time to focus on the stuff that matters.
But she
also,
does bring up another trope.
The fact that her lab assistant is Dimitri Martin, it's weird.
Yeah, I know, that was kind of funny. And I will say though that her story beat that was interesting, like you said, except for the fact that it shows up so late and is so brief, brings up another trope of these movies that, and I think we're going to talk about it overall, like how interesting it is that these movies are so tropey, even though the subgenre is so small and niche right now.
You would think they wouldn't be able to copy each other so well, but they do.
But they all hit the same things. And one of them is that after she's injected herself with the supposed cure, she sees her dad who's been infected. So, okay, she has a personal interest in the cure. But then she does the thing where she takes off her mask and kisses his forehead and basically allows herself to be exposed to the virus because of her loved one. And that happens in all three of these movies. Dustin Hoffman does it in Outbreak, and one of the military guys does it in The Flu, which was actually a really interesting moment.
There's. I have a lot of problems with the fact that the main guy in The Flu never gets infected. I'm like, he has blood coughed on him like 5 times during the course of the movie, and somehow he's never infected.
Yeah, well, he's the main character. The Flu gets a lot of passes just because of its
The Flu is
style.
a very different movie.
Yeah.
It is very accurately going for different kinds of drama, and because so every movie essentially has to go through a process of calling it shot and then following it. You have to set the tone of what kind of movie it's going to be early on, and then you have to deliver on that by the end of the movie. And a lot of the times that you don't like a movie, or there's just something upsetting about the movie, is because you think it's going to be one kind of movie at the start, and it's not that by the end. And I don't mean twists, because if it's going to be a twisty movie, you set up that there's twist in the movie early on.
Right. It's just consistency.
It's just consistency. So if there's inconsistency in the movie, that's what throws you off.
And I think that was one of the things about Outbreak, is that it started as an Outbreak movie, and then it turned into an action movie.
Yeah, it turned into an action movie with a nonsensical romance thrown in there.
Yeah. So it didn't really know what it was, but Flu kind of knows what it is the whole time. Like, you don't expect the main characters to go through realistic challenges and stuff. You just expect them to pull through. Anyway, we're going to get to that in a second. But yeah, so that's one of those tropes, is the, like, willingly exposing yourself to a loved one who has the contagion. I think one thing that I do want to bring up as far as another beat that usually happens is once the information gets out, it goes from panic buying to rioting so fast, which, you know, for a while I can hang with the panic buying, because obviously we're seeing that. But so far, at least, after, 3 or 4 weeks of our current quarantine and shelter in place stuff, there hasn't been a lot of rioting, which, given all these movies,
there's been any.
Rioting should have happened by now, and it should be widespread.
Yeah, I haven't heard reports of any rioting.
No, just like people kind of arguing in the store, but no, like, full-blown rioting.
I've heard reports of Italian mayors flying drones around with microphones on them, shouting obscenities at people who are going outside when they shouldn't be.
I saw that in New York. There was a drone that said it had some kind of really sci-fi script. It was like, please remain 6 feet apart. We must stop the spread of this virus. And it just
New York is real bad. New York is in real bad shape.
Yeah.
And I think they might be one of the few places in the world, even at least kind of started to flatten their curve. But New York is one of those places that I think is going to come the closest to one of these type situations, where there's just too many people in too close of an area. It's too tightly packed. There's not enough people, not enough medical support, not enough supplies. And I think it's going to
kind of like flu.
It'll be bad. It'll be very bad.
Mm-hmm. But we still haven't seen rioting there, at least not from the news bits that I've seen. So that's just interesting that, I want to see a lot of panic buying, but then once it turns into rioting, and it turns into rioting so fast, that's when it loses me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fair. Because it isn't really like it's a worrying thing, it's a scary thing, but it doesn't become the kind of panic that inspires rioting, or it doesn't feel like rioting is going to do any good. Yeah. Like, it doesn't feel like a meaningful effort.
Yeah. And the thing that I always kind of like come back to in those types of scenes is it almost makes me think of The Dark Knight Rises, whenever, Bane throws Gotham into anarchy, which, has its own kind of plot deficiencies as far as time frame and all that kind of stuff. But the fact that in this movie where you're trying to be so realistic, and then it turns into like full blown like breakdown of any semblance of civilization, you're like, okay, so we went from, we're kind of going along realistically to almost apocalyptic levels of inhumanity on everyone's part. Like, nobody is acting rationally. Is when it's like, okay, at this point we know that that's not how it goes. And maybe if, I don't know, maybe if the mortality rate of COVID was higher, we would be more panicked. But it just doesn't seem like that is how, people operate in a seemingly civilized society in such a short period of time.
There are no rampant house robberies going on like we see in Contagion. There doesn't seem to be a breakdown in society. It's mostly like, at least in America, like in most areas, most people are kind of just stuck inside, trying to find ways to entertain themselves.
So, Alex,
and even in Contagion, I would like to point out that there is hoarding and rioting at the grocery store, and there's still toilet paper on the shelf.
They missed that one.
Yeah, no one predicted that one. You know why? Because it's dumb.
And it prevents people from who actually need toilet paper now. Okay, it doesn't matter. Everyone knows. So, Alex, does this film resolve?
Kind of. Like, really slowly. Like, it's kind of like suddenly, like, she injects herself, then they're like, oh, it's okay now. And then there's, like, a really slow not ending.
It doesn't really end. Like, it almost does what I wanted to see, where we kind of slowly, people start to get cured and, we kind of see the skies clear. But it doesn't really get there, because we get to the point where people are getting raffled off cures, and then we get Matt Damon and his daughter's quarantine prom, which started to be really interesting because we're seeing quarantine proms right this instant, and then it just kind of ended, and I was like, okay, so I guess
like the point now.
I guess the point is that that's the new normal, which I can kind of hang with, but it didn't even really make that point very strongly.
No, and it's just a transition phase. Like, it ends on a transition phase, which is upsetting. Because, if you want to make the last third of the movie like things getting back to normal, that's fine. But you have to end with whatever the new normal is. You can't end with people still locked in their house, because that's not a resolution. That's just partway through the resolution. Or you can end when there's a cure and everyone stops panicking because, oh, we're okay. It'll be a while, but we'll be okay.
Yeah.
You can end with one of those two. But the thing is, that's not the new normal, because eventually everyone will be inoculated. So we're just seeing,
you gotta
like,
pick yourself up. You got to put the stores back together, like all that stuff that we just kind of leave it hanging.
Yeah, it's just left hanging, which is annoying.
Yeah.
And then there's like an awkward scene where she's like, where the doctor who discovered it is like refusing to like be acknowledged in the public eye or something. And it's like, okay, so she's just being more noble? Like, is that what we're doing?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to have
character is noble.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to have much of a point beyond that. Like, there's no arc to it. It's just another snippet. Like, it feels like everything we're seeing in this movie is just parts of other movies around this pandemic that we're not really getting the full arc of, which is frustrating to watch.
Everything was just interesting enough to want more of it, which, he did a good job of setting up all of these things and then not
sometimes
going in on all of them or any of them.
Let people want more. It's actually oftentimes really good to leave people wanting more, but you do have to give them enough.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so Contagion is so close to being like a great, realistic, and entertaining pandemic movie, and it just barely falls short. I think that's kind of the takeaway.
It might, and you know what? It might be because we are in the scenario right now.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too, is our perspective is very subjective right now.
And it could easily become, in the next few years, somebody does something like this again, but having lived through it, they can tell the story so much better.
Yeah.
Because essentially what we're looking at right now, and it isn't really pandemic films, because these generations, everybody who's alive right now hasn't experienced that before. Nobody who's alive right now was, well, there's some
except
people
for that
who
one 104-year-old guy.
There's some people who are old enough to have been around for Spanish flu, but if they were old enough, they were like babies.
Yeah,
so
right.
Everybody around now doesn't really have the same connection to this. So these are sci-fi films. These are decidedly sci-fi films. These are fantasy films in worlds
Sci-fi
that don't,
slash dystopia.
yeah, that don't really exist, and now they do. So now the storytelling about it is going to twist and change dramatically from this kind of storytelling to stuff that's a lot more realistic, whether it be the drama, the disaster, the intimate interpersonal storytelling, the personal growth, the complicated political angles from all parts of the world. It'll be very different moving forward, hopefully.
Or the pulpy disaster film, like Flu.
Or the pulpy disaster film. Again, I think it'll be a long time before we see a pulpy disaster film about these movies. It'll either be like 5 to 6 years, or it'll be 1 month, and I will explain why at the end of this, when we get to overall notes in the 1918 section.
Yeah.
But we're not there yet, so we're going to save it. So are you ready to move on to Flu?
Let's do it.
All right, Jason, take it away.
Flu from 2013. Emergency rescue team worker Jigu rescues Contagion Center Doctor Inhei after her car falls down a mine shaft. He later fishes her purse out as well, returns it to Inhei's daughter, Miru. Jigu is clearly interested in Inhei and ends up striking an odd but genuine friendship with Miru. Meanwhile, brothers Byung-woo and Byung-ki, who are smugglers, open up a shipping crate to find a group of dead illegal immigrants. A lone survivor of the disease that killed the immigrants escapes the container, but Byung-woo is infected in the process. Byung-woo goes to a clinic for medicine, where his coughs infect several people, who in turn start infecting the rest of the city. Byung-woo dies soon after. The disease, a strain of H5N1 or bird flu, is identified by Inhei and her team as a new mutation of the disease that can kill in 36 hours. The infection spreads rapidly, and soon the entire city is locked down and quarantined, leaving Inhei, Miru, and Jigu separated and stuck contending with panicked civilians, the military enforcement, and the government's plans to destroy the city to save the country. What's more, Miru is infected with the disease, and they'll need to find that escaped survivor of the shipping crate to make a functional blood serum cure.
All right, Jonathan, so when we look at the Flu, I think there is some interpersonal drama here, but it is very clearly set up as and is a drama within a very genre film. It is very much meant to be fast-paced action, apocalypse, exciting, driven. The characters kind of follow that. They're like pretty slapsticky. There's some interesting dramatic story beats that are all motivated within there. I like that our guy who you think is patient zero, he's not really. He survives the disease. Actually, he's the only one in a shipping container full of immigrants who are being brought in by the South Korean equivalent of coyotes into the country, who survives the disease within the crate, which is just horrific. But he's essentially the guy with the blood immunity to the disease who we're following throughout the film. And then the two smugglers, one of whom just refuses to die for most of the movie, which is just crazy. Red Jacket guy makes it through the entire thing.
Because he has to cause all the problems in the whole thing.
It's crazy. I was just impressed that he wasn't dead by the time we got to the end of the movie. You've got
That's
your crazy...
right, because he was with his brother, as his brother was showing all the symptoms.
Yeah. You've got your crazy apocalyptic prophet character in here who is also in Train to Busan.
I would say they did a pretty good job of distinguishing all the characters. I didn't get
the costume is really well done. You've got your hero who's in his rescue gear the entire time. You've got the doctor who's conveniently in a lab coat the entire time, and they give just enough explanation so it's okay that the doctor is running around in a lab coat the entire time. And then of course you have the little kid who is the little kid.
She's so good. Can we just talk about her?
Oh no, she's a fantastic actress. Sometimes, sometimes little kid actors are just annoying, but she is really good at playing convincing. She felt so
mature for her age, and she understood the character. She understood the situation. When they threw her in the most dramatic of parts, she was really emotional. She was funny, and I think more than that, she just has this watchability that people talk about sometimes with actors that is kind of hard to objectively describe, but she just has this like quality that makes you root for her, which is what makes her storyline work so well. You know,
Yeah.
as overblown as it is, like you still care about it and you're into it, because once you've kind of gotten into the movie, you know that this is over the top. You're not expecting Soderbergh level of realism or any of that. So you can kind of just go along with whatever the movie wants to throw at you. And one of the things is putting this little girl in a ton of peril, and you're just all for it.
Yeah, no, and she's really convincing. And you know what, that main triad of characters, the rescue worker, the single mother doctor, and her daughter, are a fantastic set of characters. One, they're set up, they're human, they're all fallible in some way, but they're also all compelling, like you feel willing to root for them.
I almost
And
did
three,
it with the
like,
mom at first, because she was a little annoying after she got rescued the first time.
Yeah, she was a little bit belligerent, but it was mostly played for humor, and I think that's where that was coming from.
Yeah.
And it was kind of nice to not have her be too swoony either off the get-go, which made sense. Like, nobody's friends right away in this movie, and they all kind of become friends accidentally, but the way they become friends, as odd as it is, like, you know, the rescue worker rescues her, then she's left her bag in the hole, so he has to go back, find her bag, finds her phone, her daughter calls the phone, her daughter, who, I don't know what she's doing during the day while her mother's off at work.
At school, I assumed
she's
met
at
the
school,
guy at
and
the
then
school playground.
somehow they meet at school, and then she just goes off with this dude. Thankfully, he's like a genuinely nice dude. Like, he is a caring guy. He is clearly interested in the mother. But,
and she says all the like, I'm not supposed to get in a car with strangers. So they like acknowledge all of that throughout.
Yeah. But they actually strike up a friendship that is compelling. And you know, there's a minute later in the film where they're being separated. The mother has found out that the little girl is sick, and she is hiding it because she doesn't want her to be taken away.
Part of that trope again with Kevin Spacey.
Yes, part of that trope again. But the little girl's very upset that she's being kept away from the rescue guy as well. And it makes sense that she's upset. One, they've developed that kind of like, you know, newer friendship, but also two, he like spends, once everything goes crazy at the store, he saves her like 3 or 4 times between like the mall and then the super shopping center where they meet up with the mom again. He saves her repeatedly, over and over and over. And so it's like, okay, yeah, no, I totally understand why this little girl's like, I like that guy, I want him around.
Yeah, right.
He is nice, and he keeps saving me. I want to keep him around.
I will say about the rescue guy is that his thing of always saving the people in distress because he's part of the rescue response team, like, kind of worked, but also got to like foolhardy levels at some point, like letting all the people
100%.
out of the mall that was being quarantined because there was an outbreak in there. Granted, she was part of that, but was like, okay, maybe they should just stay in there because that's protocol. And then he just like breaks them all out.
He does. He also gets blood coughed on him like 3 times during the entirety of like the mall escape.
Yeah, and no one wears like. Well, I guess they actually are wearing masks a lot of the time. This one probably the most.
The moment on the roof where all of the doctors are wearing masks, but they keep taking it off to deliver their lines.
That's the thing with this movie.
They keep taking it off, which makes sense from like a movie standpoint because you need to see like the entirety of the face to really emote. But at the same time, you're like, okay, you're the disease expert. You literally discovered this new, more deadly version of this disease, and you're taking your mask off?
I think that's another thing that if we watch this at a different time, we might have just completely ignored the mask thing. But right now, masks and gloves are being like so hyped, and they're in such high demand. They're, even being turned into jokes and fashion and all that kind of stuff that like we're so fixated on the masks and the protective gear. Like in Outbreak, there are so many times when the medical professionals are treating people without any of that on. Sometimes they're in full hazmat suits, but if they're not in full hazmat suits, they're not wearing masks or gloves. And then, yeah, in Flu, they would constantly, not just the medical people, but everyone, if they had a dramatic line to say, they would just rip their mask off. It's like taking off the glasses in an action movie.
Yeah,
and it just got to be like really
effect.
distracting.
Yeah, it was a little disingenuous. I get why they did it. I also get why hazmat suits are appealing. One, they're striking visually, and two, you still get to see the entirety of the actor's face, which is nice and typically what you're going for with camera work and, you know, all of movie making is to see that face, which is, you know, where you get emotion, where you really communicate. You want to be able to see the actor's eyes, and hopefully the rest of their face as well. So I understand why they did it, but also it seemed a little ridiculous. Of course, the whole movie is ridiculous, and it doesn't
in the best way possible. I really enjoyed this.
It is. And they, you know what, I did too. And part of the reason is the whole thing. Throughout all of the departments, all the levels of movie making knew that there was a little bit of tongue-in-cheek to this whole movie.
Yeah.
Like the color palette is bright, which is one of the things that I actually really appreciate about this movie. One, we actually do use bright colors outside all the time, everywhere. Yeah. We like to paint things bright. Superstores have bright colors in them. They have lots of whites in them. Malls have bright colors in them. They're not this dense, dark color palette. It's not like
even
the world
in
suddenly turns gray.
When they do like the essentially concentration camps and they have the huge like work lights that are just like so blue and bright, like that's still fairly accurate to like, you know, construction level work lamps.
Yeah, it adds a lot of visual flair to the movie and it makes it feel more poppy, which is nice because that's what this movie is. It also
even all the hanging plastic worked on an aesthetic level.
It did, and you know the bright colors really remind me the most of Train to Busan, which also had a really bright color palette, and kind of connected me to that movie a bit. Of course, this is just kind of like a slight alteration, really, on what Train to Busan is.
Because all these movies are like, they're literally one step below zombie movies.
Yeah, right. Like, and that's the closest thing. That's the palette they're probably going off of is outbreaks in zombie movies.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have a real world example otherwise. Not that we had real world zombies yet, but you know, we didn't have anything else to go on from a genre standpoint. So that's what we got.
Still waiting on the mutation plot point in our real life situation.
Hopefully not. I kind of doubt it. I know they can mutate fast. I know there's different strains of the coronavirus out there, but I don't think with the current quarantine we have in effect that it will mutate as fast.
Yeah.
So let's hope, and mostly let's just hope not.
Yeah. Right. No kidding.
And again, Jonathan, we do get the trope in here of someone having to make an extreme choice about whether or not to like essentially nuke the city or let the people live.
Yeah,
so I think that is an interesting challenge to throw at characters. You know, do you have it's like
the train thing, right?
It's the trolley question. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we all, you know, the trolley question, right, Jonathan? And for those of you who don't, the trolley conundrum is essentially you are near a switch on a set of trolley tracks. Currently the trolley is headed towards 5 people who are currently tied to the tracks. There's no way to stop the trolley except to pull the lever and send it on a different track. On that different track, 1 person is tied up. What do you do? Do you take no action? Do you take the action? And it's essentially, you know, greater good versus lesser
like a quarter
evil
of
type
all
question.
Star Trek episodes revolve around this.
Essentially. And here's the problem I have with this type of question in these movies is that there's always something that alleviates the painful decision making. There is never a consequence in these movies to making the decision to spare the city.
The one person never dies.
The one person never dies. Because in these scenarios, there's always something that gives you an out. Because the thing they're worried about is that if it gets out of the city, and in fact, by the end of this movie, there's like one guy who's become who we actually talked about earlier, whose name I cannot find for the life of me. It's driving me nuts. Who has made himself essentially the prophet of the apocalypse and wants to take everybody from this city and go infect Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea. He's like, let's go infect Seoul. It's the apocalypse.
He was like the head of the rescue response team or something, and he tried to hide that he was infected for a long time.
Yes. So essentially they want to go infect the rest of the world, as many people as they can, and essentially, which is a little extreme. But there's always risk in this situation.
It was a fun moment.
Which is true. But to get back to the philosophical question, there's always a risk that doing something this compassionate, and a very real risk, not a tiny risk, a very real risk, that doing something like leaving these people alive in their city might cause thousands or millions of other people to die. And there's always something that gets them out of the philosophical question to make the decision of sparing the city seem like the just and right one, which I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying there's always something in it as an out. In this one, they develop a serum, and in Outbreak, they find the carrier animal and they develop a serum.
Yeah.
But in the situation, these movies never have it be okay. But what if they did make that decision? Leave the people alone, let them have their rights, let them live in peace as they die, and then they affect the rest of the world, and then they die. They never show that level of the philosophy. There's always like this out that takes you out of the drama of that question, which is kind of why I don't like it being brought up. Because if you're going to bring it up, actually have it be a hard question.
Yeah, follow through.
Actually give that gut punch. In this movie, it kind of makes sense because it's lighter and it's slapstickier, and it's kind of, this hard genre B movie past the point where B movies are really B movies. Now they're just genre films. They're blockbusters.
Mm-hmm.
Where this is just fun. So I get why they have this out here, and they wanted to give this political level of drama in the background where the president is having this discussion with this international representative.
A fake British guy.
But, when that's an actual question, there has to be, if you're actually going to bring that question up in a very dramatic film, you have to give a hard answer to it, one way or the other, and support your stance through your cinematic rhetoric. Don't just give it like an easy out at the 11th hour.
Which I think is one of the things that, again, makes the political angle the least interesting of these movies, and why I think going forward, that's going to be much less of the focus. It's going to be background noise to the more personal stories when we inevitably come back to this type of a genre in the future. But I will say that the moment of the little girl running and crossing the line to her mother was like, it was a nice moment once we get there and once you've kind of been invested in the world. And that image of her standing in front of her mom, like between her and the machine guns, was like, reminds you of the Tiananmen Square tank man, kind of that kind of an image that they built. And I was like, that's a really nice moment, especially since we're so invested in Mira to begin with, the little girl. So that was really nice on just kind of like a visual, emotional level.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent climax to the film. It's dramatic. The characters make bad decisions over the course of the film and face up to their consequences. Then they have to change and correct their mistakes, and that's how they solve things. The CG is a little rough in this movie at times.
But they don't lean on it too heavily.
Yeah, it's not a selling point of the movie. So it's not like, oh, that's a really bad CG movie. It's like, oh, that's a disaster movie. Has some CG in it. Not the best CG, but that's okay.
You want to know what was the most striking image of the movie to you? Because there's one scene that was like, wow, I did not expect us to go that extreme.
I don't know. I kind of like the scene in the... There's like this big, wide panning shot in the supermarket where the SWAT team has come in and they're just beating people back.
SWAT showed up real fast, though.
They really did. That was a really interesting scene just because it showed, there was essentially like a line across the image between normalcy in the far reaches of the store and the panic in the other parts of the store that you could really see clearly delineated.
That scene was, again, the panic buying turning into rioting immediately that we saw in Contagion. But the moment that I'm thinking of is the shot of the crane full of body bags in the arena.
Yeah, that's right. It's almost so unreal that I forget that's in the movie.
Yeah, but it was like very striking, regardless of how over the top it was. And it's one of those things that, again, just kind of like puts it on the level of almost a Godzilla movie, is what I kept coming back to. Like, it's a monster movie. It's over the top, like almost to the level of campiness. Actually, it's past the level of campiness at a lot of points.
No, it's campy. It's campy. Yeah, there's
but
no question
campy
about that.
in a good, fun way, and it doesn't feel so cheesy as just like over the top. Almost like it's like a rung below Bollywood almost as far as the action. But that, yeah, just that wide of all the body bags in the arena being torched was like, all right, so that's the level that this movie is going to. And you kind of almost expect it to get there based on all of the elements that they have been leading up to.
Yeah. No, you expect it to go that bad. And that's when you see how high the death rate really is in the movie.
But that's the thing, is that not all those people were dead.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They were just burning all the bodies. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep, that's the flu.
That's the flu. So, yeah, let's get into overall, because I feel like we're going to have a pretty big
this is going to be
overall conversation.
Big overall conversation. We've got like 6 things to talk about here. So let's start with the things most focused on this movie, Jonathan. And I know one of the things that bugged you was people willingly being infected by their loved ones repeatedly as like a trope in this movie. Or just the fact that there could be tropes in such a small genre. It's crazy.
We've been hitting on like all of them, but yeah, that is one of them. In The Flu, they have the interesting moment of the military guy who sees his mom, and he was like,
that's right. That
pivot.
So there's that pivot. It was a bit of a ridiculous scene. It was a little over the top, but it was kind of like an oddly well fleshed out and set up like subplot. Like they planted it like a couple scenes before, and then within one scene, it was like a scene study almost of like, oh, both these characters have motivations. There's a mom character. Everything they do makes sense. It's crazy. It's absurd, but I get, given the situation, why they're doing these things. It was strangely enjoyable, except for the part that the tropes were so weird.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing with The Flu, is that the enjoyability and the entertainment value kind of overcame a lot of the incredulousness in a way that like Outbreak didn't. But
yeah, there's a very clear idea from the very start of the movie when you see this woman has somehow driven herself into this hole, which is never explained.
I just realized that it was never explained.
It was never explained, man. You just know, like, okay, this is going to be strange. This is going to be odd. Some things are maybe not going to make sense, but this is the world we're in. And that's okay because it's set up that way. Whereas in other movies, people making that same decision doesn't make nearly as much sense. Like in Outbreak, where the tone can't make up its mind what the heck it is.
Yeah.
Or in Contagion, where I don't know, characters are introduced and then suddenly have a major plot point 2 seconds later.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that kind of goes into the next point about like the varying levels of the like actual focus on the plague. Like, I think we've been kind of getting to the point that Outbreak doesn't really care about the outbreak in the film. It just cares about whatever the most entertaining thing that they can bring up is. Contagion cares a lot about the contagion, that like it spends most of the film focusing on that. And The Flu focuses on the flu for a good portion, but I still think it hits that Outbreak level of turning into a big action flick by the end when you get the helicopter or the the fighter jets coming in and being threatened to be shot out of the air, and there's still this big political toe-to-toe. So it's like there are these different levels of how much the plague itself actually matters to the movie. And I honestly, I think if now that we're talking more about like going forward, I think that the plague may still sort of take a backseat, but it may be just kind of this ever-present background threat to these human dramas. Because I think the point that we're getting to is like all the big, these are not going to be big action set piece movies going forward. They're going to be very intimate human drama stories. That
they might be large ensembles with political angles, but they will be very personal.
Yeah, and the big political angle,
the good ones will be.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, I mean, even at that point, if it's just like the plague has forced us all indoors, here's the story of this family, whatever happened to them because they couldn't leave their house, then it still won't be that much about the outbreak itself, or maybe it's, halfway through the film, someone really important to the story or our emotional gets infected, and then we have to watch their deterioration or something along those lines. It's not going to be oh my gosh, once you get this, you die in 2 days. Unless it's like literally about the plague, which is kind of one of the things that I'm thinking is a way to get around the gimmickiness of making a COVID movie specifically would be to make a period piece movie about one of the plague outbreaks in Europe. And
with like Venetian plague mask, that'd be tight.
Yeah,
I'd watch
and
that.
then
that'd be super
do
cool.
something that, is realistic to the time period and yet has a lot of parallels to our current situation. I feel like that's going to be would be an interesting way to get around making an opportunistic COVID movie.
Yeah, no, for sure. That would be pretty cool. And there's been plague outbreaks in medieval Europe. That's the most famous one. There's also been plague outbreaks in, late Renaissance Europe, late Classical Age, early Classical Age, in China, in Egypt, in Rome, all over the place for most of the current
and yet I
era.
can't think of a single plague movie.
I was shocked there isn't. There's got to be one out there about like the plague. I bet there's like a schlocky 60s or 70s.
Yeah, but there's not one that like comes to mind that has big name actors like these movies,
Yeah, which is a little surprising.
But I feel like it's not far off if someone wanted to take that angle and did it really well. Like, I would be so down for that.
That'd be pretty cool, man. It would be a very interesting angle on the film, and it would be a way to have fun with it without like bringing it too close to home. It'd be a little tongue-in-cheek.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a little...
But it could still be very dramatic. It could be very somber because, the plague is way more obviously deadly than our current situation. So you can still go to some of those extremes without leaving the realm of realism.
Yeah. And, even the bubonic plague, which is the Black Death that you are currently talking about, Jonathan, is still a thing. It is incredibly rare, and it is, if caught, incredibly treatable. One of the big
because we have germ theory now.
Yeah. So
for one thing,
in case you're wondering what came before germ theory or what germ theory is the idea, which seems really obvious to all of us now because we grew up with it, that diseases can come from microscopic living organisms known as either bacterium or, questionably on the fence about whether or not they're alive or not, viruses, or there's some fungal-based ones as well. But that those can spread between people through things like coughing or handshaking, or bodily fluids or something like that, and you can get infected with a disease that way. Before that, there was the miasma theory, which essentially believes that you got sick if you breathed bad air, which is where a lot of, and some homeopathic treatments still come from this. And it's like the idea that if you breathe certain types of air or certain incense or certain spices or certain scents in the air, it can make you sick or it can make you healthy. And that's what we had until relatively recently in, modern history. And that's why, like, in Dracula, they keep opening the freaking window.
Yeah, that's true. Whenever everyone gets sick.
Yeah, which to us makes no sense. It's like, why would you do that? That makes what the air shouldn't affect this. But to them, they're like, well, it's bad air. That's keeping her sick. We need to get some fresh air in here to make her feel better. Which is why her maid and various people keep opening the gosh darn window.
So on this topic, Alex, I just finished listening through a book called A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe, which is about the 1665 or something plague in London that affected like all of London, but wasn't too widespread other than that. And there's a bit in here where he's talking about the medicine because he was definitely of the opinion that it was, through smells and through the air and that kind of thing. But he has this one line where he says, he's talking about other people's theories about where the plague comes from. He says, I have heard it was the opinion of others that it might be distinguished by the parties breathing upon a piece of glass where the breath condensing, there might living creatures be seen by a microscope of strange, monstrous, and frightening shapes such as dragons, snakes, serpents, and devils, horrible to behold. But this I very much question the truth of, and we had no microscopes at the time, as I remember, to make the experiment with. Which is an incredibly accurate description of what viruses look like.
Yeah, no, that's exactly, that's a virus. So they were getting there.
Yeah.
It took
no one believed
some time. It took some time. But yeah, all right, so what else should we talk about when it comes to plagues on film? Well, one of the things that we have to talk about, Jonathan, is its current effect on not necessarily what movies are going to come out of this, but what
movies can come out of this.
What the industry is going to look like coming out of this.
Yeah, right.
So just to give you guys kind of a situation report of what's going on right now in Hollywood.
The Inside Report by Alex Geringer on Hollywood.
The short answer is nothing. It's a little more complicated than that, but essentially nothing. Everything's on hold. There are no productions going on right now. Sets are busy places where people come and go all the time. You're in close quarters. Mm-hmm. Everybody's like eating from the same table at craft services. It's a bountiful place if you're a virus, if you want to infect a bunch of people. So currently nothing is being made.
Not to mention actors having to touch each other just to maintain a semblance of normal acting, of living. Yeah.
Well, who knows? Maybe normal acting in a year from now will be everyone standing 6 feet apart.
Green screens are going to become very popular.
I've heard talk about trying to make some stuff from home. For some people are trying to do some more adventurous stuff out there. I've seen some stuff online about that. That could be interesting, but I don't know how soon that'll come to fruition or what that'll even be like. I'm
sure Soderbergh's got something in the works.
He's probably filming himself right now. There's probably some. There's probably there already is a lot of live shows, daytime television or night shows that are just recording from home right now.
Yeah,
because it was already just their host, so they're just working from home.
Fallon, Kimmel, like everyone is. Just zooming everyone because you can still do interviews. And honestly, that's what internet content like Rhett and Link have been doing for years, basically. And I feel like this might make a bunch of people realize that they can get the same entertainment online for free that they can watching actual television.
Oh yeah. There is definitely a lot of speculation about when Hollywood will come back online. We have predictions and we have hopes, although nothing is certain right now. Essentially, a lot of people are hoping that sometime in the summer, whether it be mid or late summer, that we can get back to work in some regard. There are certain benchmarks that would have to be cleared. The first one would essentially be a quick, easy test so that we can see who has it and who has had it and who hasn't had it.
Yeah.
Even if you can just assemble a workforce of people who already had it, and have their immunity built up already, that would be amazing. That would be great. But that's not going on. But the big thing that we really need to talk about is what Universal did. No other movie studio's done it yet, but Universal has done it, and that is all of their movies that were already in theaters or that were about to be released in theaters, they released on demand. Most of them I've seen pop up for rental through Amazon. I'm sure they might be available in some other places. But
I think
essentially,
there was a little bit of an outcry of some of that, like through iTunes. Invisible Man was like $20 to rent, which is normally what you pay to buy a digital copy.
Yes,
so people were kind of upset about that.
It's not that far off from what you pay for a ticket price either. And that's part of it being a newer system. Nobody knows how to freaking price this.
Yeah.
It'll change. But for the past 5 to 10 years or so, since streaming has really become a thing, theater chains like your AMC have essentially had a 90-day lock on releases from major studios. So if you release in a theater, it is in that theater for 90 days before it is available online for rental. And now there has been, obviously, over the past few years, a lot of movies, some of the major movies that are released on Netflix immediately or Amazon Prime immediately and available. But the old studios were still releasing through theaters first. And the theory is that the longer this goes on, the more likely other studios are going to switch to the Universal format. And the more studios that do so, the more likely it is that will become the new normal. Which, to be honest, is kind of how the world of movie watching was moving in the first place. The people who go to theaters still, outside of a few major events like Avengers,
are the people who haven't seen Outbreak.
Marvel, or the people who haven't seen Outbreak. They are the people who go to movie theaters anyway. They are the people like me or Jonathan who like to go to Alamo Drafthouse or your ArcLights, your nicer theaters that are kind of like an experience. You're going to go sit in a dark theater, see it on a large screen. You care about it. Those theaters are the ones that haven't been as affected by the changes to streaming over the past few years. Because their clientele are the ones who are going out to see movies anyway because they wanted an experience in a movie theater. And I think those will stick around. That's just my personal prediction because I do think some people will want to go see them. Also, those theaters aren't just about new releases. Both ArcLight and Alamo do either end of the release spectrum. Some of them do early releases with special events because a lot of auteur directors love those places. Like the Cinerama Dome here in LA. Last year, I got to see Once Upon a Time in Hollywood a bit early, and Quentin Tarantino was there to talk about it. Those kinds of events will still happen in theaters. Or the kind of like nostalgia-driven events or the older movies where essentially Alamo Drafthouse will for a week like condense all of their... I remember I saw like all of the Burt Reynolds movies in like a week one time when they were all programmed at the Alamo Drafthouse in New York. Just a whole bunch of them, including Cannonball Run, which was not as good as I thought it was going to be, but a lot of the other ones were pretty good. And those things are fun, but those are events that will stick around. People who want to go for the movie theater experience. Mm-hmm. For your average consumer, who pretty much waits for stuff to come out anyway to rent it if they're going to watch it at all, I think stuff is going to move primarily to being released on streaming services. And I think this is certainly not the beginning, but this is another
accelerating.
This is another step in the end of your sticky floor big box movie theaters like AMC, which is on one level a little sad, but also like just going to AMC over the past few years compared to when I went as a kid, it's just so different. Like everybody, there's nobody there anymore. Unless it was a big release day, like a Marvel movie was dropping, there was nobody there anymore.
Yeah.
So it was kind of headed that way already. Now, of course, one of the things that means is that we are, and this has been a discussion since like 2010, 2011, that we are now we would fully be in a violation of the Paramount Agreement, which we've talked about many times before on the podcast, Jonathan. The Paramount Agreement or decision essentially being that major Hollywood studios had to dissolve their complete vertical integration of the industry, vertical integration being the means of owning the production, distribution, and exhibition of movies. You can't own all of those. That's too much of a monopoly. That exhibition was given away to other chains. That's when you stop seeing like your Universal theaters or your Paramount theaters, and you start having your AMCs and other movie chains like that. And nowadays we have if this becomes the change in the industry where they're just releasing at home again on their services like Amazon, Hulu, Disney Plus, Netflix, that are all owned by these conglomerates, that is vertical integration once more. That is a monopoly, if it wasn't already. That is super Hollywood remade. That is the studio system reincarnate.
Yeah. And I think that there's a difference. In one of the articles that you sent me this week that I'll link to in the blog post, there was an interesting like single line about how one difference is that not entirely, but for the most part, streaming services don't require that much capital. Like, it takes a lot of money to build a movie theater chain, which excludes smaller companies from being able to do that. Whereas with streaming service, it's not as difficult to create a streaming service for your own company. But the other thing is that not every content company has their own streaming service. So like Netflix is pulling content from a bunch of other sources. I mean, they're working towards getting their own, putting out mostly Netflix original content, and obviously Disney now is just putting out their content. But there is still a range of that content, like of these sites that are getting content from other production companies, and so there's like a lot of technicalities, and it's just really messy. But people are gonna have to start putting some hard lines on that really, really soon.
Yeah, and everybody who doesn't have a streaming service right now has said for years that they're currently trying to develop one. Warner Brothers is trying to develop one. That's what happened to Filmstruck.
Yeah, exactly.
They went away because they wanted to pull their library back for a streaming service. Universal is working on one. Some of them already have berths in Hulu. I would say Fox was in Hulu, but Fox is no longer a thing.
Yeah, right.
So it is looking like we are moving back towards vertical integration. Now, the big difference is that studios aren't studios as they were during the Hollywood golden era anymore. They are now corporations. They are big pots of money that own things. They are not. So we're not going to have the studio heads that we saw in the 30s, in the 40s, or the 20s. We're not going to have the contract players that we saw back then. Studios just give money to production companies to make stuff, and then they claim parts of the profit back. That's what happens nowadays. Which is much more boring, if you ask me. It's not nearly as fun. But that tends to be reality. So we're not going to move back to that. But again, one of the interesting things to look at is how this compares to the last pandemic, which happened during a very nascent film industry. In 1918, the Spanish flu hit, which is right around the end of World War I, which kind of is what helped spread it around the globe. It was spreading. Then people left the war to go back home and brought it with them. So then soon the entire world was infected. It was a big deal. A large portion of the population died. But it didn't really end up in movies. Part of that is that movies were very different back then. We hadn't gone through the 60s and 70s where we were like, let's show reality.
Movies and we were very still much like about on fantasy the edge and dreams. Sound.
Yeah, sound wasn't a thing yet. So really heavy plots were a little harder to do. Everything was a bit more loose. But Hollywood did shut down for not many months, but a few months. And during that time, there were people who completely stopped production, and then there were people who essentially broke the rules and kept making movies. And it was the people who kept making movies who came out successful on the other end. And I'm not endorsing that in any way, shape, or form. But the Spanish flu essentially what it did was it took everybody who was teetering on the brink of failure in Hollywood and knocked them out. And the few people who took big bets on this or that were able to snap up everything else. And that transition from around 1918 to 1920, 1921 is when you see the formation of the truly large studios that we know. That's when famous Players Lasky becomes Paramount. That's when the Universal we know becomes Universal. Columbia becomes Columbia. All of the major players from the golden era of Hollywood become that. So around that time is kind of pushed Hollywood over the edge into becoming the mega Hollywood that was the classical golden age of Hollywood that we know.
Yeah, definitely. And so it's going to be really interesting to see the long-term effects of this because especially with studios, like you said, not being what they were, it's going to be interesting to see. I feel like they probably... most of the ones that we know already have enough infrastructure in the fact that they are all like big corporate conglomerations that probably we're not going to see any of them completely disappear, but maybe some of them will be weakened to the point where they just get gobbled up by other things like we've already been seeing.
Yeah. Disney will probably take the opportunity to gobble up some more. It's not like their revenue streams have died up. Rentals are probably through the roof. New subscription services,
which is something we didn't have in 1918.
Yeah. New subscriptions have come in. This is a chance. This is probably just going to result in big players becoming even bigger, which is, in my opinion, not great. But it's probably what's going to happen.
But I'm sure also like sales of the smaller streaming services, like CBS All Access or some of these other ones that are like just starting, I'm sure those sales are going up because people are stuck at home and looking for a broader range of content.
Oh, yes, of course. Those will be going up as well. But even the quote-unquote small players are big players.
Yeah, I know.
They are all huge.
The new players to the streaming side of it anyway.
This is true. Yeah, no, it won't just be Netflix and Disney Plus. This only serves as a catalyst to bring the streaming wars along faster.
Yeah, more competition in the online space.
So it'll be a shakeup, that's for sure. We will see what happens on the other side. But Jonathan, I think that might be enough depressing talk for now. Let's talk about what we're going to discuss next week on the podcast with our running series throughout the year.
Yeah, so we've got a new kind of smaller series that we're going to pop in a couple episodes throughout the next year. And our first one is going to be about team sports. The whole series is going to be sports in various types. And there are so many sports films that, sometimes we'll do like, a Western episode or a musicals episode. But sports is just so big that we can't even do an overview of sports films in one episode. So we're going to do 3 episodes that still don't scratch the surface. But the first one is going to be
really
yeah.
We're just kind of like sticking half of a toe in the water here. It's kind of shocking how big the world of sports movies is. They've always been big. They aren't as big recently, and part of that is because of the comic bookization of blockbusters in recent years. But during the later half of the 20th century, they were really big. And we're going to start off by talking about team sports, which have themes which tend to be in common.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people not being 6 feet apart from each other. So we're going to start
off
with
baseball.
Yeah, that's true. So we're starting off with Field of Dreams, baseball, from 1989. And then moving on to Remember the Titans to get into the football realm from 2000. And finally, Invictus, which for some reason I thought was a soccer movie, but I think it's actually a rugby movie.
It's rugby, yeah.
And that's from 2009, which stars 2 actors that we saw this week, but in very different capacities.
Oh, they were in different movies, that's right. Yeah. For some reason I thought they were in the same movie for a second. I'm wrong. I apologize. No. Jonathan, I've already watched Field of Dreams, and I think you're going to enjoy it because I realized like 30 or 40 minutes in that it was just a Twilight Zone episode.
Oh, nice.
And I was like, oh, wow, he's gonna love this.
I'm so excited because all the baseball Twilight Zone episodes are pretty terrible.
Well, I don't know if you're going to like it then, but I think you will. It's essentially...
Well, I mean, if they can pull it off, then it's an improvement.
It took me a minute to realize, but it is a Twilight Zone episode of Cat in the Cradle.
All right. I don't know how that works, but I'm excited to figure it out. So, yeah, but before we go, we got to talk about our donations. And there's been an update on the Patreon, which a lot of the people on Patreon already know. But we have added, finally, our Discord channel. So if anyone wants to kind of join the broader community of Filmlings, you can go. Anyone who subscribes on Patreon at either the $2 or $5 level will be included on the Discord, where we're going to be doing a lot of stuff in the future. Like, first of all, we're going to be basically live streaming our recording sessions of the podcast. So
there
right
might be
now,
an audience member listening right now.
There is one. So shout out to our faithful patron. But yeah, so anytime we are actually recording, you can tune in and hear us mess up and talk about random stuff and take bathroom breaks.
Say things like Flibberty Gibbet.
Flibberty Gibbet. So if that's your thing, you can see that there. Also, all of our notes while we watch the movies are now going to be posted on Discord live, so you can like watch along with us and see our thoughts in real time. And also, we're going to be doing stuff like movie parties. We had our first kind of inaugural movie party recently, and it turned out pretty well. So I think that'll be a regular thing if we do movies covered on Netflix. And
it gives me an excuse to eat ice cream while I watch a movie, so I really enjoy those. So come for more movie parties.
Yeah, so that's going to be a fun thing. So we're really building up that community. If you'd like to be part of it, you can go check out the Patreon. And also at the $5 level, we have our bonus podcast. And the last episode of that, we talked about Buster Keaton's two-reeler called 1 Week, featuring Aaron Johnson. So not in 1 week, but Aaron came to talk to us about 1 week. So that was a lot of fun.
It's been 1 week since you looked at me.
Alex also sings that on the bonus podcast. So go check all that stuff out on Patreon. We would super appreciate it.
So appreciate it. All right. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And I'm at the Blue Jay, 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
It's about you being a doctor. It's about that sacred oath that we took, remember? Billy, we've been friends for 20 years.
Yes, we're friends, Sam, but I'm also your boss. I run this outfit. It's not run by committee. You do what the hell I say do.